All right, so today we're diving into a story that's it's one of those that really grabs you, a real life mystery.
Yeah, definitely a tragic disappearance with some twists and turns along the way.
Exactly. And we're talking about the case of Colleen Monfore.
Colleen Monfore, right?
And just to kind of set the stage for anyone who might not be familiar, she was a 68-year-old American tourist who disappeared while diving in Indonesia.
Beautiful part of the world, but yeah, a diving trip turned tragic.
Absolutely. And initially, like when the news first broke, it seemed like a pretty straightforward case of a shark attack.
Yeah, the kind of story you hear about and it sends chills down your spine, right?
Exactly. And that conclusion, that initial assumption, seemed to be confirmed weeks later when fishermen discovered human remains inside a shark.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty open and shut case right there.
Right, you've got the experienced diver, the tropical paradise turned tragic, and what appears to be pretty damning evidence, but
Uh,
there's always a but, isn't there?
Always. And this is where those details, those little inconsistencies start to creep in.
Okay, so walk us through those red flags.
Mhm.
What was it about this case that made it seem like there might be more than meets the eye?
Well, for starters, there was the location of where that shark was caught. Remember, we're talking about a shark found with human remains, but this shark was caught over 70 miles away from where Colleen disappeared.
70 miles. That's not even in the same zip code for an ocean predator, right?
Exactly. It's a significant distance, and it raises some really interesting questions about shark behavior. Like, how common is it for a shark to travel that far after, consuming something?
And not just consuming, but we're assuming this is like a hunt, a kill, and then a 70-mile journey. That's a lot of exertion for any creature.
Exactly. And that discrepancy alone, that distance, was enough to make some people wonder if maybe we weren't getting the whole story.
And these weren't just armchair detectives, right? This is where Colleen's friends enter the picture.
Yeah, and this is one of the aspects of this case that I find so fascinating because these weren't just grieving friends. Many of them were experienced dive instructors themselves.
So they knew Colleen's skills, they knew the underwater environment, they had this insider knowledge that's so crucial.
Exactly. They understood the nuances of diving in a way that someone just reading a news report wouldn't.
And they weren't content to just sit back and accept the official narrative, were they?
Not at all. They actually dug into the available evidence. They examined photos from the dive. They even reviewed the data from Colleen's husband's dive computer.
Wow, so they went full-on detective mode.
They were determined to get to the bottom of this, to understand what happened to their friend.
And what did their investigation uncover? What was their main argument against the shark attack conclusion?
Well, a big part of it centered around the dive conditions that day. Remember how we talked about those little details that sometimes get overlooked?
Aren't those seemingly insignificant factors that can actually make a huge difference?
Exactly. And in this case, the current on the day of the dive was described as manageable. And when you consider that Colleen had thousands of dives under her belt.
Thousands. So we're talking about a seasoned pro here, not a novice.
Exactly. Her friends, these experienced divers themselves, they just couldn't reconcile those facts with the idea that she was simply overpowered by the environment. It just didn't add up for them.
So we've got Colleen's friends, these experienced divers, and they're raising some serious questions about the shark attack narrative, but they weren't the only ones with a different perspective, right?
Right. Colleen's husband, Mike, who was actually on the dive trip with her, he had a different theory altogether.
And this is where it gets even more interesting because Mike, he wasn't just a worried spouse, he was an avid diver himself.
Yeah, even before meeting Colleen, Mike was an experienced diver. He knew the risks, knew what to look out for.
So he had that firsthand understanding of the underwater world and its potential dangers.
Absolutely. And his theory brings up something that's so important to remember in these kinds of situations. Sometimes it's not just about the external factors, the sharks or the currents, but also about what's going on internally, medically speaking.
Right, those hidden factors that we can't always predict.
Exactly. And Mike, he believed that Colleen might have experienced some kind of medical issue underwater.
It's a tough thought, but it makes you realize that even in a controlled environment like scuba diving, things can still happen.
Absolutely. And while we don't have specific medical information about Colleen's case, it's crucial to consider the possibilities.
Right, like maybe there was an underlying condition, something even she might not have been fully aware of that was triggered by the dive.
Or maybe it was a sudden, unexpected event, something like, a stroke or a heart problem. These things happen, and unfortunately, they can be difficult to anticipate.
And then there's always the equipment. We've all had those moments where technology decides to act up at the worst possible time.
Yeah, and in a situation like diving, equipment malfunction can quickly become life-threatening.
Absolutely. It's like you can be as prepared as possible, check everything a million times, but there's always that element of the unknown.
Right, and what makes it even trickier in this case is that medical issues or equipment problems,
Hmm.
they don't always leave obvious traces, especially in an environment like the ocean.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing, lost to the depths.
Exactly. But even with those missing pieces, even with all the uncertainty surrounding what happened to Colleen, there's still that one big question mark, that one detail that keeps coming back.
It's a shark.
Yeah, the shark found with human remains.
It's hard to ignore, right? Even with all these other theories floating around.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that shark for a minute, because even though it seems like, pretty cut and dry, the reality of shark behavior and the statistics surrounding these types of encounters might surprise you.
You're going to have to explain that one to me because I'll be honest, my first thought is always those, Jaws movie scenes.
Yeah, we've all been conditioned to think that way, haven't we? But the truth is, statistically speaking, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than bitten by a shark while diving.
Seriously, now that's not something you hear every day.
Right. It really puts things into perspective. Our fear of sharks is understandable, but it's often blown out of proportion compared to the actual risk.
So if shark attacks on divers are statistically rare, and we factor in the distance this shark traveled, it makes you wonder.
Makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, this shark wasn't the predator in this story, but more of a scavenger.
A scavenger. So you're suggesting the shark might have come across Colleen's remains after something else had already happened.
It's definitely a possibility, and it's supported by another detail from the reports. Apparently, when the shark was caught, it was described as seeming unwell.
Unwell? What does that even mean for a shark?
It's hard to say for sure without examining the animal directly, but it does suggest that this wasn't your typical healthy shark on the hunt.
Okay, so we've got a potentially sick shark, acting strangely, found miles away from the original site with, yes, human remains. It's like every new detail just adds another layer to this mystery.
Exactly, and that's what makes this case so intriguing. It challenges our assumptions about sharks, about the ocean, and about how we make sense of these tragic events.
So we're really dealing with a lot of layers here. A shark acting out of character, experienced divers convinced that something else happened, and this whole idea of a medical or equipment issue.
It's like trying to untangle a fishing net after a storm. You got all these strands going in different directions, and it's hard to know where to even start.
And to make things even more complicated, we can't forget about the initial theory that Colleen might have been caught in a current and swept away from the dive site.
Right, because even in relatively calm waters, currents can be incredibly strong and unpredictable.
They're like these hidden rivers beneath the surface that can change direction without warning.
Exactly, and even an experienced diver like Colleen, someone who knew the area, could have misjudged a current or encountered something unexpected.
It makes you realize how powerful the ocean really is, even when it looks calm and inviting on the surface.
Absolutely, and that's what makes this case so fascinating. We're dealing with human behavior, natural forces, and even animal behavior, all interacting in this complex and ultimately unknowable way.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces are constantly moving, shifting with the currents.
Exactly. And speaking of pieces of the puzzle, there's one more element we need to address. It's a tough one, but it's often an unavoidable part of these kinds of investigations.
You're talking about those graphic photos mentioned in the article, right? The ones showing the shark and the remains.
Yeah, it's not something we can shy away from. As difficult as it is to look at those types of images, they can provide crucial insights in cases like this.
It's like forensic science, but instead of a crime scene, we're talking about the ocean floor. And the clues are being interpreted by experts who understand the language of decomposition and marine life.
Exactly. Those experts can look for specific signs, indicators that might point to a cause of death, or other factors that wouldn't be obvious to the untrained eye.
So even though those images might be disturbing, they can potentially offer valuable information helping us piece together what happened to Colleen.
Exactly. And yet, even with all this evidence, all these different perspectives and possibilities, we're still left with this cloud of uncertainty.
Which I think brings us to the heart of this deep dive. Because sometimes the most important takeaways aren't the definitive answers, but the questions we're left grappling with.
Colleen's story is a powerful reminder that the ocean, for all its beauty and wonder, still holds secrets that we may never fully unravel.
It's a reminder that there are forces beyond our control, events that defy easy explanation, and sometimes the best we can do is acknowledge the limits of our understanding.
It's about embracing the unknown, the unanswered questions.
Hmm.
Because in those unanswered questions, we often find more truth, more depth than we initially realize.
So where does this leave us then? What can we take away from Colleen's story?
Well, I think it highlights the importance of approaching these kinds of mysteries with humility and an open mind.
To not jump to conclusions, but to consider all the possibilities, even the ones that seem unlikely.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And to remember that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from acknowledging what we don't know.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for taking us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey.
The pleasure was all mine. And to
Wow.
our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and never underestimate the power of a good mystery.
That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.